Hey everyone, Professor Snart checking in as we actually get into our, basically the midterm of our course, which is probably hard to believe, and it may not feel like that, but it actually is, just in terms of the calendar days that we're looking at, and in terms of the unit that we're now looking at. So we've moved through clearly some introduction stuff way back at the start of our course, way back days ago when we first started. And then into the content stuff, which had us looking at really some overarching ideas, or kind of some of the fundamental things that you'll run into in any kind of world lit survey type of course. So really basic ideas about some what might be called foundational texts for certain cultures, be they sacred or not. Usually they are in some form or another, but not always. And the text that we looked at then in terms of cultures thinking about their own origins and their own very basic relationship to the world that they live in, those texts weren't necessarily all thousands of years old, although some of them were. Some of them were relatively recent, relatively speaking. Of course, as I've mentioned, the texts, quote unquote, derive from, in some cases, long oral traditions where the text, the literature, didn't actually exist in a physical format necessarily. It circulated orally from generation to generation, from one area of a culture to another. And so it really challenged some of our basic conceptions about what a foundational document would even be in terms of having sort of one official existence and one official version and that kind of thing. But it's interesting, I think, to see something like creation myths or those sort of foundational texts relative to one another for their differences and similarities. So again, this is something that I tried to bring forward in my earlier video announcement, that we want to approach this notion of world lit, first of all, not by pretending that we don't have cultural biases, but in fact being kind of hyper aware of them. And also having this dual focus of looking for sort of universality, which is a kind of a dangerous word to get into, but commonality, but also difference. So really kind of preserving both of those things is equally important. And take a really simple example like the importance of something like the sun in various sacred or foundational texts. It, in some ways, makes perfect sense when you think about it from just a human perspective, that relationship culturally to the physical environment, in this case daylight, would be so important, and also figure so prominently in the most, or some of the most important texts or oral traditions within a culture. Even if those cultures exist quite literally on opposite sides of the globe. So there was no, communication between those cultures, but they still produce sacred or foundational texts that have these really striking similarities. And it's certainly not coincidental, but is an interesting, aspect of human nature maybe expressing itself. So to go back to the sun is a good example, which shows up in both the Hebraic, Judaic tradition, but also much more obviously in the Egyptian texts we read, and then in the South American texts that we read, or South Central and even North, although that was defined later, American text. Just think about kind of your practical existence pre-electricity. It sounds silly almost, but we're so used to having lights, right, that we kind of forget about how important our relationship to the sun would be. It sounds really, I know, new agey and maybe a little corny or tangential at best, but I guess what I'm getting you to think about is how even these great, sacred, foundational masterpieces of world lit, they come out of people's very practical situations or practical relationships with the everyday realities that they live in. So if you live in a culture, particularly one that's close to the equator, and I'm not kidding about this, where the sun goes almost straight up and straight down. It doesn't spend a lot of time just kind of glossing the horizon like it did in Canada, where I grew up during the winter. It's not surprising that that figures quite centrally. And when it gets dark, really dark. So find the darkest room in your house and just go in there and look around. You don't see anything because it's dark. Now, maybe there's nights where the moon is out, so it sort of lights things up a little bit. Maybe the stars provide some sort of starlight. But your only source of light then is fire that you can keep burning through the night. And of course, when that goes out, there's pretty intense darkness going on. And that's a practical reality of your everyday life. Every single day, this same thing happens. So the rising of the sun then becomes this major, it takes on this major cultural significance and is expressed then in these very mythical terms. But notice how that mythical kind of allegoric literary event or example really can be connected to the very specific realities that some of these people were living with. And again, that might sound like you could probably write a book on this very abbreviated version of the idea I'm giving you here. But it's important to notice certain similarities between cultures, not always as just one culture derives from another or somehow communicates with another and imposes this mythic structure on the other, and so they reinvent it for their own purposes, which does happen. But in other cases, we see really just basic human realities expressed in these very mythical or literary terms. So I guess the other version of what I'm trying to say is that no matter how grand the text that we're reading, we don't want to lose that very human component or human element in it. Again, as it developed often as an oral tradition where people really did, almost as a form of therapy, and I don't mean that in any negative sense, as a form of kind of communal therapy, they talked about the world that they lived in, sometimes in mythic or abstract ways, but there was always that fundamental grounding in the reality of their lives. It's pretty interesting to notice how that produces, even in cultures that don't talk to one another because they physically couldn't. They existed at totally different times in totally different places. They produce these texts that share so many things in common sometimes. Now, the reverse of that, of course, is that they also are products of their own time and place, and so produce texts or stories about themselves that reflect those differences as well. So there's a really kind of commonsensical reason that we see differences between texts, obviously, but also some of those commonalities as well. Okay, so we've looked at that kind of stuff. We've also looked at one of these basic questions that almost every literature will address sooner rather than later, is the nature of the hero. So the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Aeneid are great examples of where part of the task of literature as it exists for a culture is to, I don't know if analyze is the right word, but embody or sort of perform human characteristics, sometimes in the form of the divine or the semi-divine, like Aeneas from the Aeneid, or Gilgamesh, for example. And in that case, you do have cultures that were probably talking to each other, historically speaking, not immediately. But the hero is this character writ large, who's not necessarily a universal constant through time. In other words, cultures produce their own version of the hero because that version makes sense for, again, the practical realities of that culture in that place at that time period. And then, of course, we looked at Unit 4, which is the roots of spirituality, the world's great religious writings, well, some of them, obviously. So a variety of traditions that we looked at, again, kind of overlapping a little bit with some of the ways that we thought about creation myths as these very basic kind of foundational texts about certain aspects of a culture, and religion being this organized kind of structure that cultures produce, but also growing out of a need for humans to ask some basic questions. Where did we come from? How did we get here? How do we relate to the world that we're in? Where are we going from here? And all of those kinds of things. So we've actually covered a lot of ground. So we've reached a point now wherein we're in Unit 5, which is our midterm essay, so we're roughly midterm in the course in terms of calendar, but it may feel like we haven't done very many units before this. I guess what I'm asking you to really be aware of is that, in fact, we have covered a whole lot of ground, and you've probably, if you've done your work, been reading quite a few pages of the masterpieces of World Lit, even if you never really stopped to notice that. Which is why our midterm takes the form that it does. It's not a pressing forward again, but a moment of reflection. And so there's certain ways in which a midterm reflection would work much better in a 16-week course. So 8 weeks go by, 2 months go by, and then you take a moment to reflect on all of that time and literature that you've covered. Well, we've covered more or less the same amount of literature, but it's just taken us much less time. And so I would argue, in fact, that a pause for reflection in some ways doesn't make a lot of sense for a course like ours, at least relative to the same way that it would work for the traditional 16-week course. But it makes even more sense for a course like ours, because if we don't force ourselves to pause, we're in such a rush to get through, to move forward through everything, that we really don't ever take a moment to think about or process some of the things that we've learned, or ideas that we've encountered, or texts that we've encountered, or cultures that we've encountered that we maybe knew nothing about, we knew a little about, we'd heard of but never really investigated, or, just as important, we thought we knew a whole bunch about, but we never actually read the book of Job, for example, right? There's some really fascinating aspects to that piece of sacred literature from one particular cultural tradition, or the Quran is another great example of that. Sure, everyone's heard of these things, but have you actually read them before? And you've certainly heard commentators who like to go on and on and on about them, and they mean this and they do that and they say this and this culture is this way because of this and that kind of thing. But it's pretty interesting to take things that we supposedly know a lot about and investigate them really from their roots. So the roots of spirituality, the spirituality part is clearly important, but the roots part of that is actually fairly important for us as well. Okay, I know I'm covering a lot of ideas here, but I'm trying to race through it all. So in a course like ours, precisely because it's compressed, it's really useful to have kind of a midterm pause here, even though very few calendar days have gone by since the start of our course. Not even 2 weeks, I think. I kind of get lost in the calendar days. You get so enmeshed in the big ideas that you're reading, you sort of lose track of other things, but that's a separate issue. Maybe it affects me more than others. Again, separate issue. Okay, so a midterm essay may feel a little unnatural in some ways, but hopefully you can see how it fits in and is particularly useful in a course like ours, not despite the compressed time, but precisely because of the compressed time. And also based on some of the things that I've talked about here, and of course the material we've covered within our class already, we really have covered a lot of intellectual ground, historical ground, cultural ground, chronological ground. I mean, just a lot of stuff we've moved through. It's pretty amazing, which is why it's a good idea to take a step back and think about that. So we have Plato's very famous Allegory of the Cave, which a lot of people have heard of but never actually read. And the more you read about it, or the more you read it, not about it, the more confusing the basic idea, in fact, becomes. It really is this fairly involved philosophical allegorical principle that he's putting forth here. But we're really just interested in the Allegory of the Cave for this basic concept of coming to new knowledge, which is I've put in the unit here. And so your question is to address one of two possibilities here in a discussion board response essay. Either you're talking about how some characters that we've discovered in the literature that we've read have come to new knowledge, pretty straightforward because almost all of them do, whether it's positive or negative or usually some combination of the two, and whether they act on that knowledge and change for better or worse or not. Or the other option is to talk about yourself coming to new knowledge in terms of learning new things in the course. And again, it could be entirely new things, texts that you've never read, cultures you've never really investigated before. Or sometimes even more interesting is to talk about coming to new knowledge in an area or a tradition that you thought you knew a lot about or had heard a lot about, but in fact discovered some interesting things that those commentators never really bring up, certain aspects of things. Satan's role in the book of Job being a great example of that. Okay, so again, we have the points value is a little bit more here because the work is a little bit more involved in terms at least of the scope of material you have to deal with. And then the really nice piece about this, I think, is that in addition to your essay, you're also doing a response piece that is worth considerable points here. So it's not just a quick, hey, I liked your discussion of the Ramayana or whatever, but you're applying the same allegory of the cave concept, the coming to new knowledge, as a way of framing your response to somebody else's essay. In other words, how has their essay caused you to come to new knowledge? And, I might have gone over time. We'll see. The thing that you want to be careful of is not just summarizing that essay. Don't do that. But give a sense of what they talked about and then really explain and develop how that is new knowledge for you. Okay, I'll cut myself off here. If you have any questions, be in touch. Otherwise, happy midterm.